So in section 10.2, we're going to look at hypothesis tests. For the population proportion, which is P. Okay? All right, so remember we said that the point estimate for P is what? That's the sample proportion, which is P hat. And how do we find P hat? Good, X over N, and X is the number that have the characteristic that we want. And what is the N? Number in the sample. The capital N is the number in the population. Okay, the lowercase n is the number in the sample. Okay, so so the first thing that we have to do before we can do the hypothesis test for the proportion is we have to make sure that the sample is a simple random sample. Okay, so that means that we selected it by maybe numbering off everybody in using the sample techniques that we talked about in the beginning of the book, like maybe numbering off everybody in the population, and then selecting random numbers that are assigned to the people, and that's how we select the people, or drawing them out of a hat. Okay, there are different sampling techniques, but the sample is random, so it's a simple random sample. Okay, then we have to show that it is a normal distribution, or approximately normal. And the way we do that is by N times P times 1 minus P. So N is the number in your sample, P is your population proportion that was in your claim, and then times 1 minus P. And we want that to be greater than or equal to 10. And if it is, then we can assume that it's normal. Okay, and then the third thing we want to check is independence. Okay, so are the sample values independent of each other? And the way we check that is that our sample size N has to be less than or equal to 5% or 0.05 of our population size, which is capital N. Okay, so you want to plug those values in. Sometimes you're not given your population size, but you know that it's super, super big. Okay, so if it's millions of people, or if it's like the American population or something like that, if it's super big, then you can usually just assume that your sample is less than 5% of that. Okay? All right, so then you're going to write out your null and alternative hypothesis. So you're going to say my null hypothesis is, since we're testing P, it's going to be P equals some value. Then my alternative hypothesis is going to be P is either less than, greater than, or not equal to, one of those three, the same number. Okay? And then you have to decide your alpha level, your level of significance. All right. And then you want to calculate your test statistic. So your test statistic for P is going to be Z equals P hat minus the mu of the population, the sampling distribution of population proportions divided by the standard deviation of the sampling distribution of population proportions, of sample proportions, sorry. Okay, so remember that from the previous chapter that the mean of the sampling distribution of population proportions is equal to P, and the standard deviation of the sampling distribution of population proportions is equal to the square root of P times 1 minus P divided by N. Okay? So when we find the test statistic Z, it's going to be P hat minus P over the square root of P times 1 minus P divided by N. And make sure that N is underneath the square root. So when you put it, when you put it in your calculator,